Good morning, America. How are ya? Monday morning rail. We'll be 500 miles before the day is gone. Hi, I'm Denny Jelsma, and I'm at the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum. Today is Monday, and you know what we do on Monday? You're right. We do show and tell, and show and tell starts right now. Show and tell starts right now, and today we have a very exciting program, and it is on the Milwaukee Southwest Limited. And it was a very popular train in the Midwest. It went from Kansas City to Milwaukee and Chicago, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. The train that I have here on display is it could run from the 1940s, right after the war, to into the early 50s. It was an all heavyweight train. They finally dieselized it in the very first part of the 1950s. They used some DL 109s on this train, but it was a train that, I don't want to call it a secondary train because it was their main train from Milwaukee and Chicago to Kansas City. But the speed, most of the time, it was 30 miles an hour, all heavyweight. They would give the Southwest Limited some knockoff cars from the other trains that they modernized. And it just really wasn't that well patronized in the later years, and they finally cut it back. But how the train left, they had two trains. One left Milwaukee and another one left Chicago. If you left the train in in Milwaukee, it took 13 hours and 25 minutes to get to Kansas City. If you got on, and if the train got out of Chicago, it was 13 hours. It was just a little shorter. And then they met in Savannah, Illinois. They put the train in one train, and they went on down to Davenport, and then they changed crews at about 2:30 in the morning in Washington, Iowa. Washington, Iowa is a little tiny town, a little farming town, about 5,000. And they say that from the 2 o'clock till 3 o'clock, that town was just fully alive, because here they had two passenger trains. This passenger train, each one of them had from 10 to 15 cars, and it just came alive. And so the next town to the south was Ottumwa. They had a real big hill that they had to go down, and in the early years they had to have helpers on it, and it crossed the Des Moines River and then the main line of the CB&Q, and they were at the mercy of the CB&Q for crossings. And so the Southwest Limited was in the early years, the turn of the century, probably all the way up into maybe to the start of the Depression, was a very popular train. But if you were a business person and you were wanting to go to Kansas City, you had a lot of options. You could take the Santa Fe, you could take the Burlington, you could take the Wabash. You had a lot of trains that you could take, and most of those trains did that trip in about 8 to 9 hours. Now, this was a night train, so the selling point on this particular train was that you got on at 7 o'clock and you got to Kansas City at 8:30 in the morning, and so you're ready to start your day. And that was quite a selling point. But towards the end, it was a rough ride. The business people, most of the business people would either go on the Santa Fe or the Q. And so my rendition here is all heavyweights. I do have a lightweight baggage, which they would throw in from time to time. You don't see a lot of pictures of this train, and the reason why, because it was a night train. But there are a few, and in the about 55, 56 era, you started to see some yellow cars show up on this, because that's when the Union Pacific decided to run all their passenger trains over the Milwaukee out of Omaha to Chicago. And so one of the things that growing up in the cornfields of Iowa was that I was probably within 50 miles of every main line in the state, and most of the streamliners that went to the west coast, and I would say 80% of them, went through Iowa. The Santa Fe went through Iowa, the Burlington went through Iowa, the Rock Island, the Illinois Central, Western Division, from Chicago to Sioux City, Iowa, and then up to Sioux Falls. And there was a lot of passenger trains that crossed into Iowa. And many of those had a night schedule, so you didn't, see a lot of them. And just the south of my hometown of Pella was the Wabash and the Des Moines Limited, and it was a heavyweight train. It kind of had the same type of a train that this Milwaukee. It was all heavyweights, and it lasted up until about 1958. But the Milwaukee Southwest Limited, and you could make connections, and Kansas City, nationally, for you name the railroad you could go to. If you're going to Oklahoma, or if you're going to Texas, or if you're going to the West Coast, I mean, you had a choice of what you wanted to go. And when we look back at that particular era, and let's say when I grew up in the late 40s and 50s, you could pick and choose whatever train you wanted according to your schedule. If you didn't mind riding a train at night and getting a Pullman, boy, you would get on, if you lived in Milwaukee, you would get on the Southwest Limited. But the first part of it naturally was coaches. It had a diner. The diner ran, they had two diners on the Chicago section. They took it off at Savannah, Illinois, which is right on the river in Iowa, across from Iowa. And then they added a diner, the train out of Kansas City. And then at Savannah is where the two trains split. One went to Milwaukee, the other one went to Chicago. And it had an observation, and I have pictures that all the way up until the mid 1950s, and they finally took it off. But they just kept cutting back on the sleepers, and I think if you look at the schedule, something in the mid 1950s is when they finally dropped the sleeping cars, and that was usually the first thing that the train would do when they were cut back. They would cut back on sleeping cars. And so I've had a lot of requests from my fellow people in the land of corn of Iowa to say, hey, you never do anything on Iowa trains. So this is an Iowa train, definitely, and very well known in that particular area. I've got another few trains I'm going to be talking about. The Iowa train, the Illinois Central had 3 trains going from Chicago all the way to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that went across to Iowa. We had the Wabash, which is one of my favorite railroads, went just south of Pella, and called the Des Moines Limited. So I'll be bringing a few of the Iowa trains mixed in with some others. You just saw on my latest posting, we had a Santa Fe, the Tulsa. So that's the way it is at the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida.